Good morning. How is everyone? Good. I'm very happy to be here. I feel that once again I have the privilege and the joy of addressing open hearts and open minds, beautiful people, my family. And through this mysterious eye that's gazing at me, people that I haven't met in my family. If you're not aware of it, my sermons are posted on our website, and you can see the videos of the sermons. Today I'm carrying on in a newly begun tradition here, that every month I speak about a Unitarian Universalist of note. Today I'm going to be speaking about Egbert Ethelred Brown. Reverend Brown was the first African-American Unitarian minister, ordained, called to the ministry. He served in Jamaica, which was his homeland. He was an immigrant to America. And then he served in New York. He served in Jamaica from 1908 until 1920. And in New York City from 1920 till 1936. I'm sorry, 1956. Yeah, 1956. Right up until his death. His story is of a complex one and not easy to relate. Because in important ways, it's a story of some of the failures of our tradition in meeting the challenge of toppling the institutions of racism and classism that afflict us still. So I want to, in the weave of this talk about the relevance of the struggle of Reverend Brown to be acknowledged and supported by Unitarians, and the struggle today that still persists with moving a tradition which is classically a tradition that's inhabited by affluent whites. Unitarian Universalists essentially are a kind of elite demographic in America and around the world. Very well educated and affluent white people. And we have made tremendous strides as a principled, progressive, liberal, religious tradition in becoming inclusive to bring in people of different sexual orientation, different class orientation. But we have lagged furthest behind in our ability to bring into our communities people of color, particularly in leadership roles, particularly African American men. You know, it's funny, I smile when I say that because I am the first African American minister of this church, which has a 125-year history. And I feel very supported by this congregation, and I feel deeply at home here. And I'm able to commit myself 100% to being here with you, because I really do feel kinship and family here. And because I feel that, I'm comfortable to begin my sermon in a sort of unusual way. Today, I want to first of all thank and give credit to my extraordinary wife. She's extraordinarily talented and creative and wonderful in more ways than I can name, but I particularly want to say something that I think is really relevant to my topic today. As an African American, I felt, growing up, so much disaffection for America's landscape of human rights that I withdrew. I opted out. I've said before, I was a hippie in the 60s. In the summer of love, I was a hippie. I didn't go to the hate because it was happening right where I lived in Greenwich Village. Why go across the country? My hippie days were spent in Montpelier, Vermont, and Greenwich Village, New York. But I was so deeply disaffected that part of how I distanced myself from the institutions and the environs of the American landscape was that I really opted out of the credentialing institutions. And my wife has believed in me from the day we met, has loved and supported and encouraged me from the day we met in ways that made me feel encouraged to rethink my disassociation from those institutions that give credentials. I went back to school, I got a degree, et cetera, et cetera. I had already credentialed myself in far eastern institutions that I didn't have the same difficulties with. Now, this is relevant because when you hear the story of Reverend Brown's progress as a Unitarian Universalist, well, Unitarian, he was a Unitarian, you will see the connection. So I give tremendous credit and thanks to my wife for her support, believing in me and encouraging me, and helping me bring out the best that I have to offer into the public forum, more mainstream. Okay, what was my disaffection based on? Hypocrisy in American life. Injustice in American life. The systemic, entrenched racism and apartheid in American life. Classism and sexism. These were the things that led to my disaffection. So Reverend Brown was born in Jamaica in 1875. As I mentioned, he had a call to the ministry, and he began that mission, that vocation, in 1908. And he struggled in Jamaica. He was a man who was, as African peoples go, ebony, black in his appearance. And I remember in the 50s and 60s reading John Killen's, for example, and then we heard the thunder, and learning a phrase that my parents, who were each born in 1924, heard. If you're white, all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. Okay? And in Jamaica, although he was erudite, brilliant, productive, even charismatic, because of his very dark color, he really couldn't make a lot of headway. That was half the problem. The other half was that Unitarianism is an extraordinary theology. It's an extraordinary theology because it actually questions assumptions that are part of the fabric of so-called Christian lifestyle. Sexism, for example. This is one of the areas that we have made tremendous strides forward. More of our clergy today are women than are men. This is to our credit. But in Jamaica, in the early 20th century, a dark-skinned African man claiming allegiance to this very strange theology that promotes women's rights and questions the Trinity and the doctrine of the Christology of Christianity, people stayed away. He might have persisted in his efforts to bring the Unitarian values to the people of Jamaica, except that he lost his supply of income. He lost an important job that permitted him to have this small developing church project. And so he came to America with the hopes of securing there, in a land that he thought would be filled with greater opportunity, that which he couldn't find in Jamaica. Now, the great misfortune, I think, that Reverend Brown encountered was that the UU president, AUA, the American Unitarian Association's president, Sam Elliott, and the secretary, Louis Cornish, were both conflicted human beings. On the one hand, they believed in the radical equality and egalitarianism that we champion in our principles when we talk about the inherent worth and dignity of every individual. They believed that. But at the same time, their consciousness was deeply afflicted by bigotry and racism against black people. evidence of this. From Mark Morrison Reed's third edition of his book, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination, I read a letter written by Louis Cornish to a would-be supporter of Reverend Brown who had written to Cornish. I speak, I believe, with no anti-Negro feeling. It's only fair to say that there are those who, in reference to Jamaica, claim Mr. Brown was frankly dishonest. Mr. Brown rather than Reverend Brown. Reverend Brown attended Medfield Lombard in Chicago and distinguished himself academically there. Mr. Brown, I would say in parentheses sick, Reverend Brown. I prefer another interpretation. I do not think he ever used any money with conscious dishonesty, but as his need was pressing, I think he has 9 children and his salary was small. He had 6 children. Later, Cornish claimed that he had 13 children. He had 6 children. I think he has 9 children and his salary was small. With true Negro reckoning, there was always a bright tomorrow when he could pay the debts of today. There are those who believe that he deliberately tried to deceive, but I believe the Negro has an extraordinary histrionic vein, and what a man expects to accomplish and what is actually his accomplishment blend happily into reality. He wrote me a few weeks ago asking for hymn books for his community church at Harlem, which I am afraid you will find exists only in paper. 30 people regularly attended his services in this church that Cornish, in his leadership role in the organization, was claiming only existed on paper. 30 to 50 people came regularly, which I'm afraid you will find exists only on paper. He preaches there once a fortnight, and I suspect that the congregation, as in Jamaica, is made up largely of his household. Again, completely misrepresenting the man. I frankly counsel that you give him no encouragement whatever in the way of financial assistance or promise to help his church. Time and time again, when people were impressed with this individual's ability, they got discouraging letters like this one from Cornish. Now, fortunately, and to the credit of our tradition, not every white-bodied Unitarian minister or leader or congregant felt that way. Many appreciated and recognized him, but as I say, they had to run the interference that was there from Eliot and Cornish, and very often they were defeated, and their help never got to the minister. And the minister struggled financially. Again, I talk about the disaffection that I felt, but think in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1950s, what it was like to be an African American representing the most cutting-edge and progressive religious tradition in Christianity in a racist society. It was entirely hostile to any exhibition of excellence or success on the part of African Americans, because it would counter the notion that these are people who need to be subjected, who cannot conduct themselves in a civilized and progressive and admirable way. But Reverend Brown had the friendship of on my desk. Oh, here it is. Yes. John Haynes Holmes was a prominent Unitarian minister in New York, a Harvard graduate, famous for his pacifism. And as a pacifist, he actually alienated himself from the Unitarian movement for a while, and he actually withdrew for a while. But he championed not only radical nonviolence, but equal rights for women and voting rights for women. Women, remember, were able to vote in 1920 for the first time in America. democracy. And he helped and befriended Reverend Brown. Reverend Holmes visited India. He met Mahatma Gandhi. And so he imbibed a lot of his values of nonviolence from Gandhi. And he championed Gandhi. Reverend Brown named his first church after Holmes. And later, when he dropped Holmes' name from it because Holmes was discountenanced from the Unitarian universe, he retained Community Church from Reverend Holmes' church name. I'm going to read you a couple of things that Brown himself wrote, but there's something I wanted to share with you that I think supports what I was saying, that it's important for us to know, and historically to note, that this man, this pioneer, as Mark Morrison Reed properly calls him, a black pioneer in a white denomination, did get a lot of support, important support from colleagues who were white. Well, I'll just from memory say, I think it's called A New Tomorrow. It was a pacifist journal that employed Brown from, I believe it was 1929 until 1934 when it folded. They had a policy of, and they were very proud of it, they proclaimed, we do not submit to the social conventions of the day which treat black people unequally, but they are members of our family and our staff, and they are treated equally. And Reverend Brown said about his tenure there, he said, I almost forgot that I was an African American, or I think he used the word Negro, that I was a Negro in America. So cordial was the environment. So that's important. So Reverend Holmes, the Medville Lombard president, when Reverend Brown initially made application to the school, the people at New Tomorrow, they welcomed him, they appreciated him, they supported him, they encouraged him. Now, in reading Mark Morrison Reed's book, I've read through it a second time. It's a difficult read because it's painful. There's a kind of meta-narrative. Mark Morrison Reed talks about his intellectual brilliance, talks about his tenacity, talks about his courage and his pioneering spirit. And there's an appreciable thread of lament, and there's an underlying thread of criticism that, as I read it the second time, I came to really deeply understand. It's one of the things that motivated me to talk about my relationship to my wife in the beginning of my talk. Reverend Brown's tenacity was seen by his biographers as both his great strength and his great weakness. How a strength? Well, he was discouraged when he first applied to Medville Lombard. They said, we're a white denomination, and there's no scope for a black minister to a white denomination, so why are you wishing to be a Unitarian Universalist? A Unitarian. Discouragement. He just, any kind of discouragement that came his way, he just thought, I'm not paying attention to that. I have my eye on the goal, and I'm going to meet that. So many instances in his life where he was discouraged and denied and repudiated, he just overlooked that. How a stumbling block. Okay, he did have 6 children. Very often, he abandoned the necessary involvement in activities other than building a church to put food on the table and pay the bills for his family, which left his wife exposed to enormous pressures, which ultimately led to a nervous breakdown for his wife. She was deeply, deeply incapacitated by the stressors that she felt because her husband was not there for her and not there for the children. 2 of his sons also suffered terribly because he had such single-minded, purposeful commitment to building a church. One son became an alcoholic and was institutionalized. for alcoholism. And another son committed suicide. So these are the things that when I was reading the biography the first time, I wasn't as well aware of. They're not so explicitly described there, but I read further. So in the big picture, what is Mark Morrison Reed's conclusion? What are the conclusions of the biographers that I have read? That had Reverend Brown received the support that a white colleague would have received, or even perhaps a light-skinned African might have received, things could have been very, very different for him. Actually, when the president who succeeded Eliot came on board, the people that came weekly to Reverend Brown's congregation moved from 30, 50, up to as many as 300 on a regular basis. And so the last years of his ministry were very successful in New York. They weren't especially financially successful. He never really reached, but that was never an aim of his, to reach financial well-being. But, okay, I promise to read some of the things that he said about himself. You get a taste of his writings. There was, coincident with childish experiments in making speeches, here he's talking about himself in his call to the ministry. There was, coincident with childish experiments in making speeches, an abnormally religious temperament. In all other respects, I think I was a normal boy, but at times I was seized by a religious fervor which I now know was abnormal. My favorite hymn was, "O Paradise, 'tis weary waiting here." I sang it often, and as I sang, my face was bathed in tears. Why should a boy have chosen a hymn so otherworldly? I somewhat outgrew the abnormal religiousness of my youth. Now, how it is that he elected to become a Unitarian? He was romancing becoming an African Methodist Episcopalian. The AME Church would have welcomed him. In fact, they did welcome him. He had an application there. But it came coincidentally with the letter, which was actually a rejection letter from the Unitarians. The president of Medfield Lombard said, "You look very qualified, but, you know, we're a white denomination. You're a black minister. There's no room for you here." Again, his tenacity was such that he took, the Unitarians think that I'm qualified? I'm going with the Unitarians. It was a letter of rejection. And the AME said, "Come on." You know, it's pretty remarkable. Why did he favor Unitarianism? Okay, one of his biographers. Later that same afternoon, he visited an uncle who had a copy of William Ellery Channing's famous speech defining Christian Unitarianism. It was sitting on his table. His uncle was a closet Unitarian and tried to dissuade his nephew from adopting beliefs he knew would be unacceptable to the family and to the community. But Ethelred insisted, so his uncle lent him the sermon to read, as well as a copy of the Unitarian hymnal. That was the end for Ethelred. He just said, okay. And he writes, I followed up by reading other Unitarian literature, and as a result, I became a Unitarian without a church. For some years, I attended no church. And then, on a Sunday morning in 1895, I was drafted to take the place of the sick organist of the Montego Bay Wesleyan Methodist Church. On that day, I began 4 years of service as an organist of that church. On my transfer to Spanish Town in 1899, I was placed in charge of the choir of the Wesleyan Church of that town. Thus, for nearly 12 years, I forgot my Unitarian theology as I engaged in these services. Then came the year of decision. With that call came a very urgent and important question, namely this: into the ministry of which denomination should I enter? Because he was so persuaded of the cutting-edge values of Unitarianism that this represents the theology that will invigorate the spiritual life of people in the modern age. He chose Unitarianism. Now, I also promised to say, so how is this relevant to today? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship I had with Bhakti Tirtha Swami. Bhakti Tirtha Swami passed away some years ago. My wife and I were present with him during the last days of his life, as were many admirers from around the world. And he is somebody who took me under his wing. Bhakti Tirtha Swami, also known as Reverend John Favors, was a very, very influential man around the world. For instance, when he would visit South Africa, where he had many disciples, Nelson Mandela would cancel whatever he was doing to go and sit and be with Bhakti Tirtha Swami. Bhakti Tirtha Swami set up communities in Africa, cottage industries, temples, places of worship, and he ordained many, many, many Africans to the ministry in Africa. He did the same in the Soviet Union. I mentioned him a couple of weeks ago in my talk on spiritual communism. Behind the Iron Curtain, another ebony black man risked life and limb to spread a spiritual message and to open centers in the Soviet Union. He was very successful at that, and he was also very successful in placing Vaishnava literature in libraries around America and around Europe, more so than anyone else. Now, he used to pay for me to visit his center in Washington, D.C., Institute for Applied Spiritual Technology, IFAS. He would pay for me to come and stay there, and he would invite me to speak to his disciples, and he'd sit there and listen. So I was thrilled, and I was petrified, because he would critique me. He was evaluating me. He was training me. Now, what am I building up to? This is a graduate. He was a graduate from Princeton University. He went there on full scholarship. When he first attempted to join the Vaishnava community as a candidate for the ministry, people within the movement said, African Americans can't understand a theology so elevated, so sublime. And they told him to his face, you people don't belong here. You should go away. I actually later worked with one of the people who told him this, who didn't have any of the intellectual training of this man, and we were taking people through a museum in a Vaishnava temple. And these people were students of theology from Columbia University in New York. And the man who told my friend to go away because black people can't understand this elevated theology proceeded to tell all the people that had come from Columbia University that the only legitimate theology in the world was the one that he possessed, and that everybody else was blindsided by the devil and going to hell. The quality of some people's consciousness. In any case, today, still, there are so many people who look at a person of color and they think, can't be on an intellectual par with a white person. Can't be productive or accountable like a white person. Cannot perform like a white person. This history that I relate about Bhakti Tirtha Swami, who opened centers around the world and created jobs for hundreds of thousands of people. This was 20 years ago in New York City, or 30, 40 years ago in New York City. Don't think that Jim Crow is dead. Jim Crow has put on a new costume and has adopted a new language. And we who wish to overturn injustice nonviolently and in a loving way, but in an effective way, cannot be fooled into thinking, oh yeah, in the early 20th century, God, in the 19th century, it was terrible. But these days we have a black president. You know, come on, guys, it's over. Racism, it's done. I mean, when I hear Obamacare instead of Affordable Health Care Act, I think racial slur, thank you. Come on. It's not over. And just as I made the case that Margaret Fuller was a martyr to the resistance to the acceptance of feminine divinity, ultimately feminine divinity was being rejected, or competent, brilliant feminine leadership. And she died off the shore of Fire Island, I think, as much because of the refusal of people to acknowledge her, to accept her, to support her, as because there was a storm at sea and the ship ran afoul of a sandbar. I think she was martyred. She didn't get money from her wealthy relatives. She didn't get acknowledgement and support and encouragement from so many in her milieu. In the same way, I think that Reverend Brown suffered many reversals, indignities, griefs, and sorrows because of racism. And it's happening still. So it's our responsibility to do work on ourselves, to speak to ourselves in a way that we can examine our hearts and purify them of any of the obstacles to meeting another human being in love and respect and compassion in a constructive way. And we also have to really work on our interpersonal relationships. So I'm first talking about we have to love ourselves nonviolently and completely and heal ourselves. That's a kind of individual process. But then we have to do that in our relationships with others. How we deal with people who disagree with us. How we deal with people who are very different from us, whose life and walk we do not understand because we haven't done it. We have to learn how to do it. We can do it. And finally, and this is one of the things that John Deere was talking about that I felt was such a refreshing thing to hear. We have to make a public stand about what is required for health and happiness and safety in a human society. We have to make public stands against the things that are threatening life. Racism, classism, sexism, speciesism. These things threaten life. They're ruining our environment, our water, our air. They're making economic disparity that is obscene. Money doesn't talk, it swears. Oh, Bill. Obscenity, who really cares? Money, it doesn't talk, it swears. We have to pay attention to these things because if the world is beautiful and safe, it's because we have applied ourselves to the task of making it so. And if it's dangerous and full of terrorism and a place that you don't want to bring children into because they're at risk, it's because we have failed to do what's necessary. So I salute the people like the first president of Medfield Lombard who finally said to Reverend Brown, come on, and encouraged him when he was there and made him feel at home when he was there. Reverend Holmes, the pacifist, the extraordinarily gifted. Reverend Holmes, by the way, helped found the NAACP and I think the Women's Voters League. He was a very forward-thinking man, and he supported Reverend Brown. And all of the people that have taken our values to heart with courage enough to do things that were socially questioned, that they would be ostracized financially and socially for doing, like our own Greta Crosby, who experienced some of that in the South in the 60s when she was on the forefront of the civil rights struggle. These people have really made the earth safe. We are those people. This church is that church. It's not the only church that's doing it. As I said, I felt blessed to be in the company of a former Jesuit. I'm not saying that we're the only ones, but we're indispensable. And the call to action is not yesterday, and it's not tomorrow. It's now, and it's today. And the first action is to clean our own hearts and to speak to ourselves with love and nonviolence, to love ourselves, each of us to love herself, himself, thoroughly, completely, and consciously. And then to love those with whom we live and work and eat and sleep and play. And then to make a public stand. We don't have to wait for another newspaper article about some mad person going into some place where people are seeking some entertainment or eating food or whatever and killing them all. We don't have to wait for that. We should not wait for that. We should understand proactively there is a sickness that's raging through our society, and we have the cure. We have the remedy. We have the antidote. Let's deliver it. I think that's what we should take away from the checkered life and story and biography of this pioneer. Egbert Ethelred Brown was a pioneer, a brilliant, tenacious, wonderful Unitarian. He didn't get the support that he deserved, and it created terrible stress for his family, for his congregants, for his friends, and for himself. To his tribute, he never gave up. To the tradition's tribute, there were those in the tradition who never ceased to support him. But the sad truth is, he needed more support, and he didn't get it. And let us not repeat the errors of history. I highly recommend that you read the dispassionate and well-researched and deeply moving biography of Reverend Brown that is in Mark Morrison's reads, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination. It's a great and important read. And I thank you for allowing me to share with you some pictures and moments from the life of this great Unitarian. Thank you very much.